There is one mistake that I have made constantly that has actually set me up for failure in my later campaigns. You know what? Fixing this mistake really just took one simple thing, one tip. That's all it took. And I'm going to share that tip today with you so you don't make the same mistakes that I made time and time again. And I'm going to share with you 12 other tips to make sure that your early campaign sets you up for success when you get to the later campaign. So that way your players are engaged from start to finish. Welcome back to How to Be a Better DM. I'm Justin Lewis, and along with my co-hosts, I've been working for the last 3 years to help you become the very best dungeon master you could possibly be. We've tried to dig into every single topic imaginable so that way you don't have to, and you can just take the wisdom that we learn and take it to your games. And today, we're going to talk about making it so your later campaign is set up perfectly so that way your players are engaged, everything's fun, and the party just doesn't dissolve. What you want to do is make sure that your early campaign has all the right elements to make sure that the later campaign is a success. To do that, I'm going to share with you 13 do's and don'ts in your early campaign. Now, let me also start off by saying every dungeon master has what works for them and what doesn't work. And if anything I say today doesn't work for you, don't use it. I have a saying that I like to say, everything works until it doesn't. I'm going to give you advice, and you're going to use that advice, and you're probably going to find that it doesn't work in certain circumstances. Great. If it doesn't work in those circumstances, don't use it. If it does work in those circumstances, though, use it. Simple as that. All right, let's get to the tips for today. Tip number 1, do plan your story arcs. If you've been listening to the show for any amount of time, you've heard me talk about the case method. I love the case method because it's very simple and it cuts things down into organizable chunks. Essentially what it stands for is campaign, arc as in story arc, session, encounter. And the idea is that you build each part of the game from the constituent parts that come before it. So for example, a campaign is built from story arcs, which is built from sessions, which is built from encounters. You don't need to plan the entire campaign. You just need to plan the story arc. And you don't need to plan the entire story arc. You just need to plan the session. And you don't need to plan or worry about the entire session. You just need to plan the encounter. You have enough encounters, you have a session. You have enough sessions, you have a story arc. You have enough story arcs, you have a campaign. The reason why you should plan out your story arcs is because it gives you a general idea of what's going to happen next. One simple example is in one of my professional dungeon mastering clients. They are in the Underdark and they're sort of stuck down there, but I gave them an item that allows them to transport to the surface for 24 hours. After that, they are teleported back to the Underdark and they have to resume whatever they were doing down there. For their journeys to the surface, I'm planning out, naturally, because they're going to go to places that they've been to, which means their family homes and things like that. I've been planning out these mini story arcs that are going to involve all of the characters' backstories. Obviously, because they're from the surface, their characters' backstories are on the surface. And for me, this is a nice way of knowing whenever they say, hey, we're going to the surface, I know exactly which story arc we're moving into. I know what we're going to do. And I have just sort of a general plan of where I'm going to go next. Now, that's not to say that's what's going to happen. In fact, tip number 2 is don't overplan. You should be maybe 2 to 3 sessions planned at most at one time. And the reason is because the players get a vote. And that's kind of a play on the military saying where the enemy gets a vote, right? You make your plans, but so do the players. And obviously they make the choices in the game, and that's what you play. I've also found that when you prepare too much, it's more likely that a lot of stuff just won't happen or won't get played. And this can even go to the point of throwing too much at your party. So one great example of this is with my current campaign, where the party had just come back from the Astral Sea, and they came back to the city of Waterdeep, where they were essentially based out of. And I threw so many different plot lines at them that I feel like they just felt none of them were really that important. They had so much to do that they felt like they didn't need to do any of it because it all was, world ending or stuff like that. So at the end, they didn't feel invested in the story, and they all felt like they needed to go separate ways. So we just skipped ahead a whole year of gameplay. And a lot of those plot lines honestly just got resolved by themselves. And that was, it was hard for me because I was planning those story arcs, but it was nice as well because it was a simple way to resolve throwing too much at my players and being too prepared. And we were able to get back to a more simplistic storyline that maybe seemed a little bit more urgent. Number 3, do allow for player-driven story arcs. You need to give room for the players to create their own story arcs. And this is important because it gives the players a sense of ownership of the game, and it also helps the game feel more real. So a great example is, back to my campaign, the reason why my party ended up going to the Astral Sea in the first place is because one of the characters in the party had a long-lost love that had disappeared, and he eventually sent out a sending spell to her, and wouldn't you know it, she's in the Astral Sea. I don't know why she was there. I didn't know at the time, at least. And when I said that, I was like, oh, great, that means we're probably going to the Astral Sea and we get to have this whole side adventure. And that whole story arc was, for the most part, completely unrelated to the main plot of the game, but the party liked it. They seemed to enjoy a change in scenery, and they got the opportunity to want to go back home and get back to what they were doing, which I think is sometimes a fun element to throw into the game because it allows the players and the characters to sort of feel the same thing. Obviously, you don't want to do it for too long, and at the end, I think we were doing it too long, so we ended up skipping a little bit just to get back to the game. Number 4, don't forget the sizzle. Sell the sizzle, not just the steak. That's a famous phrase that you hear in a lot of sales environments, and it's very true, right? If you've ever gone to a restaurant where you could order the fajitas, you recognize when someone comes out and has ordered the fajitas, right? The waiters, they bring the food to the table on this kind of metal skillet, and the food is just sizzling. And everyone looks, and obviously it's a very attention-grabbing moment because you feel the food being cooked, right? You hear it, and you can. It's a visceral connection you have with those pops and sizzles. With D&D, it's not just a game. It's not just a story. It's an interactive experience. So you need to make it sizzle. And a great example of this, and what I mean, is Caden. He's a friend of the show, and over the summer. Over last summer, he stepped in and sort of became the DM for our group for a while. And he ran us through this campaign where we were going through this forest, and it was all very whimsical, and it was very cool. And Caden brought the sizzle. He is a very good painter of minis. And time after time, our jaws would hit the floor when he would reveal his next big mini, right? We would see this kind of troll-looking thing with 7 eyes, and it's all painted to look like wood, and it was green. It was very amazing. And then the next session, he'd bring out like a snail the size of a house, and you could actually pull off the roof, and everything inside was painted. It was quite amazing. Now, obviously, those are Caden's skills. He has a 3D printer. He can make that work. For you need to figure out what is your sizzle. What can you bring to the table that will make the experience more memorable? And honestly, you're going to have to try out a lot of things to figure out what you can actually do, right? I know on my case, I've been trying to make a bigger effort at presenting minis or tabletop displays or things like that in a beautiful way. I'm not an artistic person, so it's actually been quite a challenge for me and something that I'm still working on. But if you're wondering what the biggest mistake I made was with most of my campaigns so far, is that I constantly forget the sizzle. I forget to make it just that little extra bit special or bring kind of the wow factor to my games that makes the sessions memorable. And if you want to fix this, like I said, you got to try things out to find out what your sizzle is, what works. And that means you're going to have to try lots of different things and probably be super sucky at some of them until you find what works.
We all have strengths and weaknesses as DMs, but that's why I appreciate our sponsor, worldsmith.io. If you're not confident making a map quickly, use their map generator. Or maybe you're much better at making new characters than you are creating a new NPC or monster stat block. Don't worry about that either. It has separate generators for each of those. I even made an evil reindeer mini-boss for my holiday-themed campaign. The same is true for items, quests, traps, and more. Whatever you don't feel confident in creating, or whatever you don't have time to create on the fly, you can use worldsmith.io's generators to bring your D&D campaign to the next level, which, as you know, is what our podcast is all about. Check out sessionzerostudios.com/worldsmith-podcast to learn more and support our show. Link is in the description.
Hey, bud. How's it going? Just wanted to say, we like you. We think you're pretty cool. And we hope you like us too. If you do like us and what we're doing, you can support us on Patreon. Just $1 a month is enough. Just go to sessionzerostudios.com/Patreon and show your support. But even if you don't, we still like you, bud. See you around, bud. You obviously have good taste. I mean, you listen to How to Be a Better DM, after all. We thank you so much for your support. And if you've ever gotten anything useful from How to Be a Better DM, take a minute and rate us and review us on your podcast listening app of choice. It goes a very long way to helping our show help many more dungeon masters out there who are just like you. If you love our content, help others become better dungeon masters too. Number 5, do establish a campaign theme. If you listen to Matt Colville, he kind of talks about this as the center problem, the central issue or central problem. But this is important because it ties everything in the game together. Players can look back over all the story arcs, all the sessions, all the encounters, and see, oh yes, there was kind of this core element connecting everything together. Now, themes can be kind of what the story is based on. For me, themes are topics or ideas that I sort of want to explore, asking questions, and then letting my characters answer those questions, right? For example, friendship. What does it mean to be a friendship, or to be a friend? In this case, you could have one character who has a best friend. That best friend turns out to be on the villain's team, and they're constantly at odds, but they still respect each other and have these fond memories of being kids together. And then the best friend helps the character against another evil faction, but then betrays the character later on. And all these are interesting moments to ask questions. Are they still friends, right? What does it mean to be a friend? When do you stop being someone's friend? And I think if you add in those theme elements, it makes the campaign a lot more deep, but also you can connect story plots that don't necessarily seem like they connect. Also, it allows you to foreshadow, which we'll get to in a bit. Number 6, don't force the theme every single session. If you've listened to me for any amount of time, you know that I'm not a big fan of Disney, specifically like Disney within the last 10 years. Actually, before that, Disney was pretty good, right? Atlantis, super awesome. Treasure Planet, so good. I'm actually a big fan of Brother Bear, all that. But specifically as it revolves around their newer stuff, and also specifically as it revolves around Star Wars, I don't like Disney. I hate it because, in my opinion, they are trying to shove their message down your throats, even at the risk of getting in the way of the story, right? I understand if you have a message, but the story has to come first, and people can find the message because they love the story, and that's how you sell a message. But Disney does it the wrong way, and you might be doing it the wrong way too. Are you trying to force your theme down the throat of your characters every session, right? Just because, like our last example, just because one character has this best friend doesn't mean the best friend should be showing up every session and doing something weird or interfering with the party or asking these questions, right? There should be some pacing involved So that way the party just doesn't get so tired of the theme that they don't care about the game. Number 7, do care about player and character motivations. Every player enjoys D&D for a different reason, right? There are some that love loot. There are some that love the story, lore, puzzles, combat, whatever, right? All the players play for different reasons. Even more, their characters have motivations as well. And sometimes those motivations will be slightly aligned. Sometimes they won't. But as a dungeon master in the early campaign, if you can figure out what motivates the player and the character and keep an eye on that, because it will change, you'll be able to better encourage the players to give the best they can to the game, and they will feel like they're getting the best they can from the game. A great example of this is, again, back to my professional dungeon mastering client. One of the players is highly motivated by loot and equipment, right? They love it. I'm not so much that way myself, right? I generally find it kind of tedious, so I don't really care as much about it. But because it matters so much to this player, I've tried to add in certain elements that make it fun for them. For example, they are a forge cleric, a dwarven forge cleric, and this means that they can craft basically a lot of stuff. Well, as I already mentioned, they have this ability to transport to the surface, and I've made it so when they do transport to the surface, this dwarf, via access to his god, has access to kind of this souped up forge that lets him craft some things at a higher rate or better quality. And moving forward, I'm going to be dropping some kind of exotic items that this character might be able to use to create magical weapons or special effects or things like that. Again, for them, equipment is very important. The rest of the people in the party aren't so motivated, though they do like loot. But for them, I'm definitely focusing much more on story elements, roleplay, things like that. Number 8. Don't go nuts with the sprinkles. Magic items, I mean. In a lot of my early games, I've accidentally doled out magical items that I shouldn't have and given my parties a lot more magical items than they should have. And this is a big problem in the early campaign because it can really off-balance the later campaign. And because, for one, you're likely going to resist giving them magical items because they already have some. And some of the magic of the game will kind of be lost because they won't feel the need to explore that extra room in the dungeon for more treasure. The second reason is because it can unbalance the game really quickly. In the 2014 edition of Dungeons & Dragons, and honestly the 2024 edition, the game isn't really set up to look at challenge rating of monsters as it compares to players or characters with magic items. It's just their level. So the second you put in a magic item, it offsets that a lot. And that can be really difficult to deal with, especially in the early part of the campaign when they have a lot of magic items. The trajectory is likely they're going to get better magic items because they're going to get more gold, they're going to get more connections, and they're going to be able to leverage those to get those better magic items. So that difference between what is challenging to them and where they're at grows. And using the challenge rating system to balance your encounters becomes a lot more harder. Honestly, in my opinion, it's better to trickle out very low magic items and then ask your players from time to time, hey, what sort of magic items would you be interested in? And then when they do want those, that becomes quest material, right? They have to do something big to go get those items. Another reason why doling out those magic items early in the campaign can be difficult and unhelpful is because often those are worth a lot of money, right? If you give a +2 weapon to a character early on in a campaign, it's very possible that it could just sell that, and then now the entire group has a whole ton of money, and that sort of offsets or unbalances the economy of the group early in the game, and then from there things can sort of spiral. So don't go nuts with the sprinkles. Number 9, do homebrew monsters and encounters. And I say this all the time, homebrew early and often, because every campaign is different. You're going to have to get used to the individual group, and that is going to take time. And when you can homebrew early on in the campaign, each individual monster will require less variables to provide a challenge to the party. At the first, you're probably going to mess with health AC and maybe some damage, like 1 or 2 different attacks or something like that. Maybe they'll have a couple spells. But later in the campaign, like for example, my party's level 16 right now. Homebrewing monsters for them that are a challenge is much more difficult because there's so much more wiggle room, and getting those encounters where the party's like hair's breadth away from death is much more difficult. And often I generally lean towards not giving them enough of a challenge because I don't want to just kill them, but then that makes the game less fun. So if you can homebrew monsters early in your campaign and get good at it, it'll help you later on because you'll have that practice, you'll have those repetitions, and you'll know your party much better. Number 10, don't flesh out the entire world. And this is really a tip for you world builders out there that spend so much time world building that you never actually get to playing your game. Yeah, I'm talking to you. I love world building. It's super fun, but there's an important part of world building that is actually exemplified in the movie Robots by DreamWorks. I love that movie. I used to watch it for Spanish class in high school because we had to watch movies in Spanish every now and then, and I really enjoyed it. And there's a part in the movie where Ratchet is talking to his mother, Madame Gasket, and his mother has sort of climbed up through the air vents into his office in the big building and things like that. As they're talking, if you look around the room they're in, you'll realize that the room they're in has literally no details, right? There's nothing on the walls. You don't even know if they're standing on the floor because you never see the floor. For all intents and purposes, you just see them and kind of a backdrop. That's it. And that's brilliant because the scene is still compelling. DreamWorks has understood that when it comes to world building, you only world build the details that matter to the story. And yes, you do need to world build a little bit extra and then reduce the scope of your story so that way it feels like there's more behind the corner. But at the same time, you don't need to world build everything. You just need to do enough so that way your players find it engaging and they want to interact with it. And also, it allows the players to add something to the world as well. Number 11, do go off script. Early on in your campaign, you'll probably be playing and you'll have something written down for your session, or you'll be working off of a pre-written module, and then a player will want to do something not in the script. Or even better, you'll think of something more fun than the script and you'll want to go off that particular rabbit hole. Do it. This is officially your permission to just follow those feelings, go off script in the early campaign because, one, it sets the tone for the rest of the campaign, and two, it allows you to follow that added story arc for a little bit longer, allowing the player to sort of inject their own playerness into the game. And that's going to result in a much more fun game. A great example of this is actually in that same paid campaign that I'm running. The party was in the Underdark and they met this oracle, and the oracle essentially gave them a mission, right? Find out what's going on in the Underdark. I'm running Out of the Abyss, if you're wondering. And the oracle, obviously not in the game, I added it in, but mid-session, while the oracle was talking to the players, I had this kind of thought. I thought that the oracle felt super bad for the players, or for the characters, and the mission that they had to do. And obviously the characters wanted to go back to the surface. The oracle wanted to help them, but was limited because of reasons I can't fully say on this podcast. So mid-conversation, I decided that the oracle would give the party a boon, a blessing, a magic item that when worn would transport whoever is wearing it to the surface for 24 hours. And that's sort of how my idea of this magic item that gets them to the surface and back was born. It was just something I thought up on the spot. And frankly, it has been one of my favorite parts of this campaign because it's made it much more dynamic. And I think it's allowed for a lot more player choice, as well as some interesting consequences. Number 12, do foreshadow. I already said this, but foreshadowing is very important because, like I said with the theme, it allows the players to look back and make connections across the entire game. Foreshadowing is also very important because it can give characters and players a hint of what's coming next. It builds tension, and then later on, while the story progresses, you can sort of release that tension and then build it up again and release it. And that's kind of some of the emotional effects that we get from the game. In fact, in Star Wars, we get foreshadowing, right? When Yoda is testing Anakin and he says, "Much fear I sense in you." That's an example of foreshadowing, right? Because we know later on Anakin goes off the rails because he's afraid of not being in control. And he's proud because he is so powerful, right? It's kind of that double-edged sword. You get a sense of what's happening next. And like I said, it builds that tension. Another example of foreshadowing is in Lord of the Rings, right? Frodo gets a sword that turns blue when orcs appear. And that kind of tells you, hey, at some point during this story, orcs are going to appear. And wouldn't you know it, they're in the Mines of Moria. So Frodo pulls out his sword and, wow, it's glowing blue. But you don't see the orcs. So it builds tension and it kind of keeps that tension alive. This is one of the tips that has really helped me as a DM, because now I'm a little bit more willing to kind of throw out random things that could be foreshadows that if the party kind of latches onto, then I can develop more into actual story elements later in the game. And I think this is kind of fun because instead of you choose your own adventure, the party chooses the adventure, and you sort of get to dangle different bits and pieces in front of them, and then they pick the ones that they think are interesting, and that's what develops into a foreshadowed element. So sort of a kind of a backwards way of thinking there. Last one, number 13, don't throw in too much of the BBEG to start off. A lot of foreshadowing will involve the BBEG, or at least possible appearances or mentions or things like that. This is all fine and dandy, but one of the problems with playing D&D is that you're not really certain of anything. So if you throw in too much BBEG at the beginning, you might be stuck with who the party has to face at the end. I say make it somewhat vague because you never know who the actual bad guy is going to be fully, right? The story is going to change and develop and probably become a lot more interesting, maybe even developing its own BBEG that is more interesting than the one you had at the beginning. In my case, my party was going through Princes of the Apocalypse, which is a module from Wizards of the Coast, and obviously they were going through the Nora campaign, but slowly through a magic item that was cursed and some interesting choices from my wife, a new BBEG came into the picture, which was more interesting and frankly more fun for both me and the party, and now that's who they're facing. So when you are teasing out who the BBG is, make sure it's somewhat vague so you can always change it. Overall, there's tons and tons of do's and don'ts. I probably didn't cover half as many as I could have, and probably 10 times as more as I should have. But at the end of the day, hopefully this has inspired you to go out and find your own do's and don'ts, things that work for you and things that help you in your early campaign make it so players play through and get to the late campaign and still want more. As I said, the biggest mistake I've made is forgetting the sizzle. So what's the biggest mistake you're making? Make sure to reach out to us on Instagram or Discord and let us know. Let us know what sort of successes you're finding or problems you're facing, and we'd love to talk to you about it. Also, make sure to rate and review us on your podcast app of choice, wherever you're listening to this. Thank you so much for supporting us and being here week in and week out. I'm just really grateful for you sticking in and being there with us from start to finish. Me and Tanner are doing the best we can to give you the best content possible, and we're still getting better at this, so if you have any suggestions, we'd also love to hear that. But we'll be back next week with another handcrafted episode made just for you. Until then, let's go ahead and roll initiative. Brought to you by Session Zero Studios. For more information, visit sessionzerostudios.com.